Hi again, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode in our Talking Sports series. It's a weekly webinar created by 11 Sports in partnership with World Football Summit. And every Thursday, we bring together leading figures from across the industry to share their insights and expertise on the fight back from COVID-19. My name is David Garrido. I am the main event host for World Football Summit. And for me, at least, 29th of January this year was when the gravity of the coronavirus outbreak really hit home. The 2020 World Athletics Championships, I think it was in Nanjing, were postponed. It was the first major event of its kind in its magnitude to be postponed, followed by the Chinese Super League. And by then, of course, already cases of COVID-19 had been discovered outside China. So this outbreak was becoming an epidemic and ultimately a pandemic. And I also remember being on air the day that the organisers of the Olympic Games finally admitted defeat and were forced to postpone the Games. The IOC and the Japanese government that 2021 was the only suitable option to stage the so-called greatest show on earth. Obviously, huge blow to Japan. They've spent more than $12 billion on the event and considerable sums at stake for sponsors and broadcasters too. In fact, Goldman Sachs said that Japan might lose $4.5 billion in inbound and domestic consumption this calendar year. But at least sport as a whole has rallied, and now we are seeing those green shoots of recovery, and plenty of them. Football is back in the Bundesliga, La Liga and the Premier League, behind closed doors, of course. Serie A will follow very soon. Golf's PGA Tour has resumed. Super Rugby, the first competition which has returned hosting games with fans in stadia, New Zealand having been declared virus-free. Now, being at different stages of combating COVID-19 in different countries has thrown up all sorts of challenges, but we've seen how leagues have got creative in order to get restarted. NBA and MLS heading to Disney World in Orlando, Florida to complete their campaigns, for example. So everyone is establishing what their new normal looks like, and at least the lockdown has afforded us all more of that precious commodity of time. Now, some sports have spent that time strategizing, working out what the pivot they need is, maybe accelerating a change that was already in the pipeline to alter their sport for the better. We will mull over some of those examples over the next hour. Now, I'm really just scratching the surface here. I'm sure that our three guests this afternoon will have plenty more to add. And they are Frank Leanders, who is Director General of FIBA, Marissa Pache, who is the Chief Marketing Officer of World Rugby, and Charlie Marshall, CEO of the European Club Association. And our moderator to shape the session, my esteemed media colleague, Pedro Pinto, who is, of course, a presenter for 11 Sports themselves and the co-founder and CEO of Empower Sports. Now, I am sure that these four will all contribute to a fascinating discussion. But remember, the discussion isn't just theirs to have. It's yours too. And there are two main ways in which you can have your say. One is with the questions that you can submit via the questions tab on the right of your screen. We'll try to include them. And the other is the polls that we'll be putting up throughout the session where you can cast your vote. The first of those is live right now, and it asks this. How did the break in live sport make you feel? Two options here. I missed sport and couldn't wait for it to return. And it made me realize I could disconnect from sport. And we want you to be honest here. Get involved, make your choice, and we will update you on the result of that poll and the ones that follow a little bit later on. So, well, that's pretty much as far as my preamble is concerned. Let's get straight into the discussion. Pedro, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, David. I have to say, I'm very impressed with the energy you're bringing to the table, also by the very professional-looking microphone you have at your house. I don't. I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar, the latest episode in the Talking Sports series, entitled What Lies Ahead for Global Sport, Post-COVID Challenges and Opportunities. I'd also like to welcome myself, Marissa, Frank, and Charlie to the discussion, and again, encourage everyone who's watching to participate. Welcome to my home in Lisbon, the wonders of the pandemic-style broadcasting has taken the audience into all of our homes many times. And I bring up Lisbon because it is relevant editorially. Yesterday, UEFA announced that Lisbon, Portugal will be hosting a Final Eight tournament in the UEFA Champions League. Charlie, we'll get to that in a moment. However, I would like to ask everyone, and perhaps starting with Marissa, what's the state of play in your respective sports, rugby, basketball, and football? How many matches are taking place? Where are they taking place? And are there fans involved at the moment or not?
Yeah, that's a tough question for us. As World Rugby, our main property is obviously our World Rugby World Cups, both women's, men's, and the Sevens tournament. So those are in 1, 2, and 3 years time. So still a lot of time ahead for those. The rest of our competitions, unfortunately, are suspended. Our HSBC World Rugby 7 series is suspended. However, there is rugby being played in the Southern Hemisphere. As was introduced to us, we knew that we've got Super Rugby happening with Sandar series in New Zealand with crowds, world first, and it'll soon head to Australia. So it's only going to get better from here, and we're situation planning for everything. So we're looking forward to it.
What about you, Frank?
Get the microphone on. Good afternoon, everybody. Also from the Geneva area, from the House of Basketball, which is open since weeks in different shifts. I think there's different ways of handling that. The basketball world is, let's say, on a global level, competitions are still suspended. Hopefully, we can soon announce that we can open that up in specific places and for specific disciplines. But luckily, some national leagues are back in Europe. Germany, like in football, is BBL is back on track. The ACB in Spain is back. I just had to check, Pedro, to also tell you that Nicaragua and Turkmenistan are playing to the application. And actually, during the pandemic, it is fair to say, also partially thanks to 11 Sports Taiwan, that the Chinese Taipei League managed to finish the league. And that was, very exclusive content suddenly in that period. And in working together with 11 colleagues, we had the pleasure to broadcast on some social channels, and you could see the people were hungry for the sport. Now, of course, in terms of the bigger leagues, people know that NBA will have a model to start end of July out of Disney World, as was referenced, and the CBA in China is scheduled to start in 2 venues, bringing all the teams there in 2 days' time. On the weekend, they should be back, but the situation changes per day. So at the moment, for the good, and the acceleration seems to be faster, but we remain cautious.
Thanks, Frank. Status report recognized. On to football, Charlie.
Thanks, Pedro. Hi, guys. I'm just down the road from Frank. I think if I lean out of my window here, I could probably wave. We're just down in Neon in Geneva, and thank you for inviting me to your home, Pedro, and to Pandemic TV. It's always a pleasure to be here. I think that after what probably seemed an interminable time, although when we look back, it'll probably seem just like a moment, football has clearly started to return in full force, I would say. Hats off to a few special mentions who never stopped. Belarus being the famous example in Europe, and also Nicaragua, I believe, in Latin America, also continued to play throughout. The Bundesliga in Germany was probably the biggest league that got started the soonest, and as you see, Bayern Munich already had enough time to win the title, as they did a few days ago in the Bundesliga. Really, over the past 10 days, the pace has upped, and most leagues now have restarted. I think what's been interesting, if you look across the domestic leagues in Europe, is actually now the speed at which fans are coming back in some shape or form into the stadium. As I've said before, the kind of severing of match day attendance, and therefore the severing of the income related to match day attendance, is the big system shock to sport at the moment, and to football in particular. I don't think of all of the things we couldn't have imagined that have resulted as due to COVID-19. That is the one thing that was almost unthinkable, having empty stadia and empty venues worldwide. And so clearly there is now a lot of will to get fans back into the stadium in the right way. And everything we've done across all sport and across all football, and I'm very proud to be part of all of that, has been with a real focus on doing things in the right way, respecting medical protocols, respecting government doctrine, respecting the safety of players, of staff, of fans. Within those parameters, though, we're seeing the return of fans. And indeed, there are games taking place across Europe with fans. Poland, Denmark. In fact, I did a little count. There are now 17 domestic leagues who are playing with fans of some shape or form. So that's football. Of course, yesterday, I won't steal the thunder for later on, but the announcement yesterday was around when the European club competitions are expected to resume, namely the Champions League and the Europa League, the UEFA club competitions. The idea is now for them to complete in some quite new formats during the month of August. You mentioned Lisbon for the Champions League, Germany for the Europa League. So our eyes are now very much set on having the domestic seasons complete around late July and then play the European club competitions throughout August. So it feels like we're motoring now.
Look, there's so much to talk about. I just want to at least chronologically discuss the moment when you realized we were dealing with something unprecedented and that your sports had to stop. It's the first time any recent generation has been faced with this phenomenon. Nothing is on. You can't participate in anything yourself as someone who's also used to being active. So when was that moment for you? Where were you? And how quickly did your organization realize, wait a minute, we've got to act fast, and we've got to act to make a decision that makes sense, or participate in a process with a decision that makes sense?
To me, we'll
go back. You can go first. You can go first. Doesn't matter.
David mentioned a couple of events that took place sort of January, February time, where it started to look that things were gonna change. There was a period of time then throughout, I would say, late February, early March, particularly for football, where things carried on a very uncertain footing, and fans started to be kept out of the stadia. And it was sort of that first week of March that really started to look like it was going to go in a different direction. I think, personally speaking, that the moment I realized was actually when I had a member of the team here come back from a region of northern Italy, and within 24 hours say to me, I need to go into quarantine. There's been an outbreak of coronavirus. Some cities in northern Italy, or some areas, have been shut down, and I need to go into quarantine for 2 weeks. And that was the light bulb moment. And I thought, if that's going to happen to a member of our staff here, it's going to happen worldwide, and it's going to affect everything. And that was my light bulb moment. And it happened very quickly from then. By mid-March, we were shut down.
What about you, Marissa?
We had two tournaments in LA and in Canada taking place in the 7th series. And that was in March, so we were close to lockdown at that point, but it hadn't yet happened. We were just really discussing with massive crowds what can be done. You started to hear reports about people at the LA airport having coronavirus, and we were thinking, my gosh, we got to get everybody out of there. Fortunately, we did. Our organization had been in crisis planning since January, but not over coronavirus, over the riots in Hong Kong, because we have a major tournament in Hong Kong. So we were on that mindset of what happens if. And so we were very quick to respond. The week before the lockdown, the week before anybody was even talking about a lockdown, and because our offices are based in Dublin, our management team, we decided to have a spontaneous, no notice day where everyone had to work from home to see if the systems would hold up. Who left their laptops at home? Would the internet crash? Would the servers come down? And we did that. And lo and behold, the very next week, it was all shut down. My light bulb moment was my EA. She called me in the middle of the night and said, I'm in the hospital. I think I have coronavirus. And they kept her in there for testing. And same as you, Charlie, it was like, oh, this is serious. Do we have to go into lockdown? What's going to happen? So it happened fast.
Well, what about in the basketball world, Frank? When you realized something needed to be done?
We're probably before football and rugby in this case. I mean, we had an Olympic qualifying tournament in the first week of February in Foshan in China, the women's qualifier, and we moved that event, or we brought the Chinese team to Serbia to play out of caution, and so that was already a real warning that something was boiling. But as always with these things, I mean, you have the tendency to feel this is far away, this is a Chinese thing, this is an Asian thing, until you see it really coming closer. And it's quite amazing with this how long people it took people to realize also on individual cases, because then it came of course to Europe, to mainland Europe, and it started in northern Italy, what you said, and gradually moved over. And on the 13th of March, I really remember that like yesterday. I was in London, and I saw all these people hanging in pubs on the street on a sunny day. And I thought, these guys have no idea what is going to happen here. Guys, you are, get out of this place. This is, the writing is on the wall. But, everybody still thought this is a little flu. It's on the other side. It doesn't happen to us. We'll get away with it. And unfortunately, that was not the case.
I wanted to bring in a question from Al Sarpong and here directly to Charlie regarding the stoppage of football in France, professional football in France, where Ligue 1 was obviously terminated very, very early. A question on, do you think this was too hasty a decision in hindsight?
Well, I think people obviously do focus on the French decision because of the relative, I think, size of that league and popularity of the league. But don't forget that it wasn't the only one. Actually, 12, if I'm right, of the leagues decided for one reason or another not to complete the season. But France drew the headlines for sure. The challenge that we all face, and actually I think it goes for everybody on the call, because we all in some shape or form manage international sport rather than domestic sport, was this notion that whilst centrally we could do everything in our power to try and keep local jurisdictions in some shape or form together and unified, it was never going to be up to us. It was never going to be up to central sports bodies to say what should or shouldn't be done in local jurisdictions. And so we just had to make the best of trying to kind of keep everyone together by sheer force of will. When that French decision came, and one in the Netherlands came at a very similar time, it definitely did shoot a shockwave through us, and actually I think the consideration at the time was, will this create a domino effect? Will now further national governments and therefore national leagues start to close down? But it sort of held there, actually. It sort of held, and other jurisdictions took a bit more time, did some planning about how they could genuinely get the seasons up and running again. And as we've seen, that's now come to pass. So I'm not going to speak for the French government, obviously, or the league, but I do think that it's a very difficult situation for them to be in now, especially given what has happened and the resumption of other competitions across Europe.
Pedro, may I jump in? And maybe I can be more controversial because I'm not in the football world anymore. So I can maybe speak also a little bit more openly. And I have seen what happened also in the Netherlands. And I think in hindsight, that's a big remark to make. I definitely think that the Netherlands and France have been taking longer term decisions far too early. I mean, I think in for instance, in the Netherlands, it's not even what Charlie says, a national decision. There you have, let's say, city-based, you have mayors saying yes or no. And at that point in time, it was the general feeling that when people are dying, when things are in the hospital, you cannot put a priority over a game of football. And then you always get, with football in particular, the feeling these are all millionaires and these are all rich guys and whatever. And it's a very difficult PR battle to have then, what I saw in the Netherlands. But for me, it's absolutely crystal clear that now where they sit and to say, to decide in April that you can only start playing sports behind closed doors on the 1st of September, was for me a big mistake.
Discussing and I'd like to bring up the poll here, because I think it's quite interesting that 1 out of every 3 people, and I'm imagining they're sports fans that are watching mostly this webinar, for 1 out of every 3 sports fans here saying that they could disconnect from sport, you could see it as a little bit of a warning that maybe sports are not as indispensable as all of us thought they were. So the question to you is, how did you try to continue the engagement with sports fans around the world and use your communications channels around the world without the livelihood of what you have to offer, which is games? And maybe here, start with Marissa.
Yeah, we took a multi-factor approach. I mean, we brought in a lot of the old games, the archive, which has been massively been underutilized at World Rugby. So we started to bring in the old games, but we also brought in the stars, the heroes, and had them interviewed, made them very accessible via our Instagram channels, and started creating new content. You know, one thing that I've learned from this is that under the most incredible circumstances, the team can continue to be creative. And that was probably the most important thing. What can you create to make exciting content and keep people engaged? And you know what? They were engaged. Our video views were fantastic. Our engagement was still up off the back of a very successful Rugby World Cup in September to November last year. So we did well. And looking at the poll results, you know, 66% people saying they miss sport, but 34 saying that they could have disconnected. I'd say the same about me in restaurants. You know, where would I sit? Did I think I could live without going to a restaurant? No, absolutely not. Now I'm cooking all the time. So it's a question of perspective.
How did you utilize your channels across football and rugby to try to continue that interaction, or how did you see your industries continue that interaction with fans?
I mean, we just made it ourselves very accessible. We made our players as accessible as we could. And again, we brought in the archive content and released a lot of those old dusty games that were phenomenal and fantastic and got people excited about what their nation was able to do in that time. And it was to great success.
What about you, Frank and Charlie? Because I think Marissa brought up a really good point. We really saw athletes have the time to interact with people as human beings and become closer to them.
Yeah, no, I subscribe to what Marissa said, and you've seen that across the board. Of course, we have done an enormous amount with our FIBA media team on those archives, but not just also playing out the archives, but then, you know, replaying games and then taking get the commentary from the athletes that were there. So to take legendary games and then involve the players that, you know, the French team that beat the US in the World Cup and have you know, Fournier, Batum, etc., commentating that game, for instance. So there's been a lot of creativity there from broadcast and digital teams to fill the gap. I still must say that you know, with all the creativity and all the great work that is being done, it's for me not more than a temporary stop. I mean, nothing beats the live passion. And if you see now, where everybody may be criticizing empty stadiums in the Bundesliga, if you take the example, or whatever, but you know, the Coppa Italia comes back, which is normally maybe not the highlight. What it is last week, you know, Juventus, Milan, empty stadium, you know, still 8, 9, 10 million people watching that because they have been waiting for the real deal to come back, and that is still you know, the live games where you don't know the result.
What about you, Charlie?
I'd echo both of those sort of points of view, and maybe though I can take a turn to be a little bit more controversial and a little bit critical about football because I actually think that there's been a bit of a general dearth, I have to say, of innovation and creativity in football. I think it shows really well how poorly set up the football world is to deal with non-live engagement. And I think this is an issue which, as many issues, probably all issues that we're talking about through COVID, they're not really issues because of COVID, other than the match day empty that I talked about earlier. They're ones which we knew about already, but we've had a bit of time to try and reflect on, even though we've been desperately trying to fix things as well. This is an issue which has existed in sport, and particularly football, for decades, which is all of the value is in the live window. All of the engagement is in the live window. And as an industry, the way that we're structured, the way that rights work, the way that competitions and clubs sit together, the way that clubs and players sit together, is really not geared towards creating and filling the space between live matches with highly engaging, highly valuable, really refreshed content. I'm afraid that the sort of flight to the archive, which was the right thing to do in some shape or form, it quite quickly became dry. Even in football, even when you had such a rich archive to lean on. So I think that I would be kind of critical more than anything else of how we've done it. And it's taken some shining examples to show that. And I know it's been the talk of the week, but you have to highlight what Marcus Rashford has done with the campaign. And you know, he's campaigned for school meal vouchers to be sustained for children during summer, which was a government decision to stop that. And through absolute dedicated passion and genuine authenticity, he's created a platform that no other club and no other competition organizer has been able to create in this time, and has effected incredible change. And that is a sort of shining example which came out of nowhere. All of the planning that we could have done as an industry couldn't have created that. So a hell of a lot to learn in this space. I'm not saying we're going to change, to Frank's point, what is always the core of sport. It's the live, unpredictable experience. But I think we can think much, much harder about what we do when we don't have that in future.
I will say that I feel sometimes sport, and football in particular, is a little bit spoiled with the attention it naturally gets. So it doesn't really think about being proactive in that connection. They think, well, they're there already. We just need to protect. We don't need to promote. And I think, this is my opinion, I think that this pandemic has maybe made a lot of people rethink that. And I'll pick up here on the question from Benjamin Blot, or Benjamin Blot. I don't know how to pronounce that, but what matters is that he talks about the lockdown as an opportunity for your respective business to think about content strategy and try new things. How would you answer this question?
Yeah, maybe to jump in on that quickly, because I think this is a super relevant question. I mean, specifically, if you are, a football league, a top football league, as we know, many of them are a little bit drugged by the traditional TV money in particular. Some of them, they even, they don't really care. That is the driver, and then there's people in the stadium, specifically in the sponsor business seats, and they're quite comfortable with that specific model. So I think it's a super good, and I think therefore also, I can say when you have some sports realities which are not that spoiled in a way, they're automatically forced to be more hungry and more creative and look for alternatives. But honestly, if you take that topic, what Charlie raised wider, you can say the same a little bit also for our broadcast partners, because there's also a lot of sports broadcasters which lean 90+% on the live content, and others less. Others are more creative, and also they have then been struggling in this period. What do we offer to our subscribers? And I think there's also an element there about saying, oh shit, we don't have this live anymore. Now we need to go back into the archive, and what was offered there was quite poor. And that's why in that window you saw the perfect timing of The Last Dance, the documentary of Michael Jordan, which was supposed to be later in the year. And by anticipating, they had an empty field, and the whole world, the basketball world, the sports world, and beyond that, was talking about MJ and The Last Dance. He had it all open there. I mean,
Mhm.
we work a lot with Nike. Their business, of course, also with shops everywhere closed, has been suffering. Online is not compensating for that, but I don't think it's a secret that the Jordan brand has been going like a rocket. So there was an empty space, and they managed to dominate that space.
From our side, I mean, there's two sides to this story for us. On the one side, we had to think of new ways of producing the content, new formats. How did we make our own moderators, our own hosts, our own commentary teams be able to work from home, producers, and making things exciting, which was one part of the story. The other side is, of course, the natural budget cuts that comes with stadiums being empty, no live sport. So you're having to be super creative and work with your agencies and your own team. And yet, on the other hand, you're having to look at budgets very, very carefully and scrutinize and make sure that you're spending every dollar very, very carefully. And that's the double-edged sword of this. But it's made us very creative, I can tell you that.
Mm. Do you agree, Charlie?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, look, I think it goes back a little bit to what I was saying before. I think the interesting thing to reflect on going forwards is really how do we fill the gaps in a better way in future. I sort of feel that with this topic and with other topics, the real disappointment would be coming out of what we've learned over the past 3 months and just going back to the old ways of doing things. And I talked a little bit about some of the blockers that exist in football, in particular, the rights structures which actually prohibit collaboration between the main stakeholders, because everybody's very protective of their own positions. To Frank's point, I'd like to see some of those getting broken down. I'd like to see some more collaborative venturing between clubs and competition organisers and between players and clubs. I'd like people to come out of their traditional silos a little bit more and be more creative, and that means being more open and more innovative commercially before you can be more creative before you can be more open creatively. The rise of the documentary is definitely an example of how this can start to come about, because those documentaries they're about the stories. They're about the stories of sport that exist outside of the game itself. But we need more of that. We need to leverage the new ways we have of engaging with consumers, not just through Netflix and Amazon, but through all of the trends we've seen over the last 20 years, the proliferation of digital media, the interconnectivity between different platforms. We need to be able to tell stories across those platforms, and we can only do it together if we reshape those industry structures to allow it. That's the learning, and that's what we need to drive.
I wanted to pivot on that regarding content and digital, to talk a little bit about esports and maybe launch a second poll question, which is COVID-19 gave esports an opportunity to gain wider exposure in the absence of traditional sports. And we'd like for everyone who's watching to vote here. How did you consume esports during the pandemic? How did you see a lot of teams and athletes participate in esports games and tournaments? Did this wake up the traditionalists in your respective sports and industries to the importance of esports? And do you think it accelerated a transformation that was already happening?
I'll take that one a little bit. One of the things that has surprised me, or maybe not surprised me, but one of the things I had my eye on was whether esports could achieve one of its biggest goals as a developing area, which is to actually acquire audience and acquire fans outside of the obvious demographic which it appeals to. So without question, engagement within that core demographic has increased. It was increasing anyway, but with an obvious playing field for esports to go into, you definitely saw engagement increase amongst that core target audience. But I'm not sure whether it started to achieve that goal of breaking into new ground, of actually acquiring audience from the more traditional aspects of sport. And I have tried to look at the effect of different tournaments and initiatives that have taken place within esports. And I haven't really seen signs of that, which is a real lesson. One other thing we've seen, though, is that because focus went onto esports, or a fair amount of focus went onto esports, a lot of those questions which people were kind of ignoring within traditional sports came to the fore. And I still think esports suffers from a real lack of understanding about what it actually is. Certainly when you look at it from a football club's perspective. Is it e-football or is it esports? Is this about my players playing for my team? Or is this about my players playing for any team in any jersey? And what does that matter? You know, is it about EA Sports and FIFA, or is it about Konami, and is it about PES? Those questions, which were sort of being a little bit ignored on an industrial level, there's much more, let's say, focus on answering those, and therefore trying to answer the question of how does traditional sports really play in esports. Again, I hope we can continue to find time for that when we get a resuming of the traditional side of the game. But that was my take on it.
Any other opinions on the rise of esports and how you experimented with it, and how you see it accelerated perhaps in the near future?
Yes, Pedro, I will also jump on that point. Personally, I also more on the line with Charlie. I don't think that has been like a fundamental change there. Let's say cannibalizing the traditional sports, if you want. But at the same time, I think there is a growing audience, as we know, in that space. And you know, I think the period has accelerated that, and very concretely also in our case, I mean, there were discussions since 6-12 months about esports, e-basketball, NBA 2K. So I mean, we would not consider ourselves to get involved in League of Legends or other games. Really, the e version of basketball. And now that has also accelerated. And actually, tomorrow, I tell all the viewers, go on Twitch or on YouTube, and you can watch the FIBA Esports Open. It is national teams. It's a pilot between some national federations which say, yeah, we want to play against other national teams. And I must say, since we have announced it, I'm just amazed, honestly, by the number of federations and people that want to get involved, but also on the corporate side, a lot of companies say, listen, can we be involved? How can we be part of this? And also on the broadcast side, that would like to distribute it. So there is a lot of traction there, and that's also I think the interesting thing for the sport is, because we think basketball and then you go and play NBA 2K, but actually there's a lot of younger demographics that come to basketball from the esports. They have they start watching NBA and basketball, maybe picking up a ball and bouncing it, which we still want them to do, from the game. So we shouldn't underestimate that development at all. But I'm very honest. Maybe if in 24 months we have a group like this, it will also be interesting for me to see where esports then stands in the ecosystem of FIBA. Is it a promotional element? Is it a discipline? It's too early to tell, but it's definitely already very, very substantial. We have federations in the Baltics, in Russia, but our federation in the Philippines, they are all over this.
I wanted to give the results of this poll so far, and it's clear that among the people watching, most couldn't wait for the return of traditional sports. Unless Marissa is passionate about answering this question, I'm going to move on to another one, and you can use your body language to be very excited about this, or if you don't act in that manner, I'm going to move on to another question.
I'll let you go on to the other. I'm sure my connection dropped off, so I'm sure all the topics got covered. Obviously, esports, v gaming is a as a conversation many sports organizations are having, watching motorsports particularly really take off at this time. That's my background. And they did it so successfully. So it's opened up the conversation for every sports federation that doesn't have either an esports or a gaming strategy.
Yeah, I wanted to go to India because Robin Nirwana asked a very pertinent question, I think. The panelists see an increase in revenue from subsequent broadcasting and digital rights, or the absence of in-stadia crowds will have a negative impact on the valuation of these rights if stadia continue to remain closed, of course. How do you see that impacting the value of broadcasting and digital rights? And I'll start with you, Marissa.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not we see an increase in revenue from the absence of in-stadia crowds, I don't think so. I'm not sure if I'm being controversial by saying that. I think part of what we see on TV is as much feeling a part of the atmosphere. And that's a huge part of not just what you're watching on TV if you're doing it passively, but also the so-called second screen and third screen experience. You know, you really want to wrap that audience in sort of bubble wrap and make them completely immersed in what they're seeing. And if you're looking at an empty stadium, I'm not sure our broadcast rights will be impacted positively from some of on Rugby World Cup in 2019, some of our best matches with the Japanese fans. People were watching just to see the crowds.
You're there. I see you.
My connection seems very unstable. So no, I was just saying that the Rugby World Cup was one of the most successful television audiences, and you know, respectively, the broadcast valuation was fantastic. But that's just as much the atmosphere as it is what's on the pitch.
I would say as a fan that it's harder to engage with a game when there is no feeling and emotion inside the stadium, because I think you connect as a human being with the emotions that you see the fans have in the stadium as well. And it's interesting to see what La Liga has done with bringing in virtual fans and virtual chants as well. But I'll let Frank and Charlie also give their opinion on the valuation of rights and how they can be affected by the closed stadia. Maybe on an immediate impact, more fans will be signing up for OTT services because they can't be there anymore. But what about the valuation?
I mean, I'll shoot, and forgive me because I lost Marissa's audio, so I will hope I won't be repetitive because I didn't hear what she said. But yeah, I agree with you, Pedro. It's a sort of short-term, long-term question for me. It's clearly a very different product. It's clearly a very, very different product from a consumer point of view, a sports arena with no fans in. And admirable as the innovations have been in a very short space of time, virtual fans, simulated crowd noise, stadium dressing that obviously minimizes those empty seats being on camera. They don't really, I mean, they clearly don't bring the product back to what it was and what it is when you have fans thronging the stadiums. The impact on valuation, therefore, is again not an immediate one. We don't want to get into kind of contract speak here, but you know, delivering a live feed of a game is one of the things that underpins all broadcasting contracts. And no one really had to think before about whether the presence of fans within that feed was an important part of value. So, okay, that's the short-term thing. What does it change going forward? You know, are we going to start to see commercial partners think much more about these kinds of eventualities? You know, these kind of force majeure events that might happen and how they affect one way or the other value. I think that's a very interesting point. I think the other thing to do a bit more future gazing is if we had a bit more time and if we had a bit more deliberation about it, are there changes which can be made much more fundamentally to the coverage and the distribution of the product itself, which actually take away this issue if you think about the way that you watch an e-football game, if you think about that visual experience you have, the camera angles, the sorts of things that you see as a consumer, difficult to achieve in the logistics and physics of filming a live football game, but that's something that we can really work on. Watch NFL and watch the introduction of the Skycam to NFL coverage over the last 6-7 years. It's fundamentally redesigned the way that that sport looks on screen. And we can think about, virtual reality. We've all probably worn those headsets and looked at a sports event, as it were, from the shoulder of, Lionel Messi as he plays the game. Those kind of production innovations are really what is going to be needed if we're to alter the trajectory here of what's really trying to sort of put a quick fix in until fans can come back.
Yeah, I think this kind of answers Will Martin's question as well, with the fact that sports rights holders maybe have to have more innovation and work with startups to improve the interactivity and social aspects of their products. Because I'll just, for Frank, for you to have a say in this as well, I'll add an element to the conversation, which is the interactivity element. I think the broadcast angle of it is crucial, that Charlie talked about as well. I personally don't understand as a fan why the spider cam many times in football is not used more often, since it gets so close to the action, much closer than the traditional cameras in the stands get. But as far as the closeness of the action and the social interaction, maybe kind of like a Twitch-based feed that people can have access to, also to interact with the product, with the traditional broadcast. Do you see certain things like that be tested in the traditional broadcasting model, Frank, or am I?
You see, no, Pedro, you hear a lot of, and all of us, I'm sure, we see a lot of examples and suggestions and technologies which come up now, and some of it has been introduced softly, I would say, by La Liga and a little bit by the Bundesliga on the audio. I think there's much more to come. Two things to say is that I think firstly in basketball we have a little bit easier because we can blacken out the arena. We don't have a massive stadium, so you can make it like in a theater. You can have the theater view already in a game with full audience. Your spotlights are on the court, so you don't have that visual element. But secondly, I mean, I subscribe what was said. I think short term, not so much impact. Longer term, much more. And I definitely hope that in the middle, longer term, the audience can come back. What I'm really going to be interested in the next few months, also, Peter, when you talk about the Champions League in your hometown, is how will that impact on certain teams and players? Because I think, some teams have had a big benefit of playing at home in Dortmund or at Anfield, and now they're playing in a neutral environment. And as we know, some players are better in training than normally in the game. So, I mean, maybe some players need the stage of 80,000 to thrive, and others paralyzed. So it's going to be interesting to see on the sports side who are going to be the winners in this, and who are going to lift the trophies in these empty arenas.
I'm going to bring in the last poll question, and also to start wrapping up the conversation. What is the biggest priority for sports post-coronavirus? Is it economic consolidation, elite level performance, grassroots participation, or digital engagement of fan community? I think this is quite an interesting one to put to you. And maybe Charlie, you can go first, since you're the only one that's unmuted at the moment.
I'm terrified of muting, otherwise I may never come back. Very interesting to sort of try and choose one of those four. I would probably go for I mean, this is going to be a real cop-out answer, but actually all four of them are fundamental. And therefore, I think the biggest priority is making sure that whatever system comes out of the coronavirus does a better job at managing the balance between all four, frankly. And I'll obviously give the example of football. In football, and it's the same in other sports, you have a pyramid system. You have a pyramid system which works both from a sporting perspective and from an economic perspective. The consequence of that pyramid system is that the value is driven at the top. It is the big brands that drive all of the value. And then through various mechanisms, that value is redistributed in the form of, well, many forms, either direct subsidy or player transfers or collective sales of media rights. And it sustains in some shape or form the bit of the pyramid, which if it was left by itself, would be unsustainable. And therefore, what that does is it puts elite performance, which is one of the priorities, together with grassroots participation, and it hangs them together in an economic system. I think that the real challenge of coronavirus and before coronavirus was that system creaks. It creaks at the edges. The bigger ones tend to want more freedom, less subsidy, and the smaller ones, of course, don't want to get left behind. And it's also important in terms of sports' role in society, not to break the pyramid up too much, because if you lose the roots into participation, then in the medium to long term, you're going to lose the sport itself. I'm not saying the system is optimal now, and I think one of the things we should really do, and we're trying to do, is to take stock of what coronavirus has taught us to really answer the question, what is the shape of the system in the digital age, in an age where this is not all about fans going to venues on a Sunday afternoon. This is very, very palpably now about global content and global product and global access. So how do we marry those two things? Too big a question to give an answer to right now, but that's probably the priority for me.
So far, the top two answers are economic consolidation and grassroots participation, I guess, because grassroots participation is at the bottom of everything, at the bottom of the pyramid. If there's no one playing, then everything else will kind of collapse. But without wanting to influence the answers of Frank or Marissa, how do you see the priorities moving forward?
I couldn't echo what Charlie said more. When I first started World Rugby, I said, our mission is to grow the global game. What does that mean? And every department that I spoke to had a different answer. And those are 4 of the departments that I have right on my screen with the poll answers. And it's exactly what Charlie said. It's about making everybody understand that what they do is also dependent on all of those other things. It's a circle. You can't have one without the other.
Just one.
Yeah.
Frank?
Yeah, as a good traditional federation person, of course, I have to say grassroots. That is as a priority. But personally, I'm more eyeing the economic reset, and I think some points have been mentioned by Marissa and Charlie. I think if you look at the sports world now, everybody always talks about risk management and scenario planning, and people go through the motions and get a consultant and put it in the drawer. And actually, when it happens, you're not ready for any of the things properly. And I think that sport and sport across the board is very high profile, pretty significant money going around, but the profile is still higher than the money. As we always say, I mean, Real Madrid is what, 500, 600 million, but there's tons of companies which have a bigger volume, but you never heard of them. But the thing with all that profile and revenues and money, most of these organizations have no reserves whatsoever. They live cash in, cash out. Actually, many of these organizations, they've set up organizations, their future season tickets, their future television money, and they already spend that on the market. And I know that Charlie and the UEFA, they're doing a lot of work with financial fair play, trying to police and to fight. But you see, when you come now to the situation, and that's what I fear, what will happen over the next months, in a way that there will be all the funds, the private equities lined up, and they will be ready with a cash check in their pocket, and they will get a seat at the table, and they will be able to take far more influence into the game than I think is good for the sport.
Last question to wrap this up. and I appreciate you sharing your insight and expertise with us regarding this very important topic. But what was your biggest learning about your own sport and its sustainability during the coronavirus? And Frank has already touched on this with the economic reserves and being ready for something that may come. And most sporting teams, let's say at least, living on the limit of getting the results they need to stay in a job, essentially. So what's the biggest learning for the sustainability of the sport?
Shall I have a go?
Let's go.
I would say the definition of the word sustainability. I think that is the biggest learning here, because it is a term that has evolved in kind of corporate speak over the last couple of decades, and it means a number of different things to a number of different people. But I think those who studied the area realize that it's a bigger concept than any one thing. It's a bigger concept than CSR. It's a bigger concept than environmentalness. It's a bigger concept than financial sustainability. It really is about the place of organizations, be they corporate, public. It's basically about the place of institutions within society on a medium to long-term basis, and to root and to bring sustainability to sport and the organizations which inhabit it. And as we talked a bit earlier, you know, the players and the personalities that inhabit it, it needs a very kind of multifaceted definition of that word sustainability. It needs economic restructuring, it needs economic thinking, it needs deep social thinking as well. Not just sort of running social campaigns here and there, but a very different model of integrating sports socially into what we do, into society. I can bore you for you know, hours about some of the great examples of that we've seen within football and within football clubs. But I think coming together as an industry and really agreeing on a definition of sustainability is one of the things we've learned most.
Marissa, you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very similar answer, but you know, we talk about this all the time, and that coronavirus has really made it's the ultimate equalizer. It makes you prioritize the very, very most important parts of what's going on in your sport and what your sport does for the audience that's watching, the sponsors, the partners. And for us, and it's very humbling, rugby is very much about authenticity. And that's something that we've all, you know, carried along, that the sport hasn't been professional for very long. Certainly in the men's side, women's side is really just getting there. So it's made us realize what's important, and we have to stick to our core values and rely on the accessibility of the sport right now, and make sure that our audience feels that and that we can connect, particularly with new fans as they come to us.
Last word for Frank.
I will make it short. We talked about the economic part. If I may take something else out of it, it's really, you know, to have you know, as I said, certain scenario planning, but also your communication systems ready. And actually, there we also have had quite a lot of opportunities. I mean, we are having a webinar here now, instead of sitting somewhere on the stage in London or whatever, and it works pretty well, I think. I hope the reactions are the same, but also more on an institutional level. I mean, we have had 2 central board meetings and executive committee meetings with people from Auckland, New Zealand to Los Angeles, simultaneously translated in 5 languages, all remote, and that has worked. And it's not the pattern for every meeting, because you also want to have a glass of wine and talk to somebody at some point, but it worked. It meant everybody's now used to these fantastic platforms, and we saved a lot of money in terms of travel costs along the way.
Clearly. David's joined us also to wrap up the session officially. But from my side, I just wanted to thank the panelists, myself, and everybody who participated as well on the chat and by sending in their questions as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Pedro. Yeah, I mean, I think for hosts and moderators like you and I, that was a dream session. 3 great speakers, some consensus, some disagreement, but plenty of opinion. I mean, Frank starting off by saying that the KNVB in France made mistakes by calling off their seasons early, and lots of other opinions. Charlie saying there's a dearth of innovation and creativity in football, especially on how we deal with non-live engagement, but also Marissa chiming in saying that she was impressed by how people can be creative in times of need, and the archive and accessibility was key for them during lockdown at World Rugby. Talk about e-football or esports. Again, it's something that I've wondered myself, actually, Charlie. Do people know the distinction? Was this the opportunity to bring it to them and explain it? I think it was the opportunity, but I think work still needs to be done. And no fundamental change so far. And that was really reflected in the result of the second poll about esports getting that opportunity to be exposed more widely because of the absence of traditional sports. Marissa talking about second and third screen viewers. Again, that is a conversation I'm sure will develop, and totally immersing those viewers, but still how important fans are to the offering when we are doing a sporting event, seeing them in the stadiums. Just still, with the Rugby World Cup, what an example that was with the home fans particularly. And then some interesting just musings from Charlie towards the end. Will we see a change to how sports operate and how they're set up in an era of globalization with global audience, global product, global access? Is it going to be a pyramid? Is it going to be a circle? What other shape might it well be? I'm sure that we'll find out in the years to come as that gets changed and it evolves. And sustainability we touched on as well. Frank, Marissa, Charlie, you've been excellent guests. Thank you so much for your contributions, and Pedro, as always, for shaping the discussion as well. We really appreciate you coming on to this webinar for us too. Next Thursday, by the way, we are looking at virtual opportunities. We're focusing on how sports commercial partners, so sponsors and the like, have had to find new ways of engaging fans virtually, if you like. How do these experiments impact and then inform those activations going forward in the future? We're going to be joined by another group of industry experts for the discussion, so please make sure that you stay close to 11 Sports and World Football Summit's social channels for more details. But for now, thank you very much indeed to all of you. Have a great rest of your week and weekend, and we'll see you again soon.